40 days, 145 Fahrenheit. Water is life and death. U.S. Marines face Chinese forces in Gobi Desert where temperature reaches 145 degrees and water scarcity turns logistics into life-or-death struggle. 6,000 Marines against 22,000 Chinese troops in an environment where dehydration kills faster than bullets and controlling water sources matters more than controlling terrain. 6 weeks where modern warfare devolves to primitive fight over water and survival requires accepting that whoever controls hydration controls battlefield. But there's something about this desert warfare that intelligence never predicted. Something discovered on day 18 that changes everything. And when you understand what that was, this entire campaign suddenly reveals why water is ultimate weapon in desert, and some enemies weaponize thirst more effectively than they employ conventional firepower. But here's what they won't tell you about fighting at 145 degrees for 40 days where water is scarce. Dehydration doesn't just weaken soldiers. It destroys cognitive function. Decision-making fails. Coordination collapses. Soldiers become disoriented. At day 23, more Marine casualties came from dehydration-induced mistakes than from Chinese fire. And the reason Marines couldn't withdraw wasn't tactical impossibility. It was water dependency that made retreating through waterless desert more deadly than continuing forward where water sources existed under Chinese control. Recently, territorial tensions forced U.S. Marines into Gobi Desert operation where temperatures exceeded 145 Fahrenheit and water sources were sparse and controlled. Chinese forces had fortified desert positions, knowing that controlling water meant controlling battlefield. What should have been brief operation became 40-day ordeal, where water logistics mattered more than firepower and dehydration proved deadlier than combat. Marines learned that desert warfare is ultimately about water and enemy that controls hydration controls everything. Welcome to the Navy Chronicle, where we decode operations that prove water is most strategic resource in desert warfare and dehydration is weapon that some enemies wield more effectively than any conventional military capability. The Gobi Desert was strategic corridor. Both sides needed access. Chinese forces had occupied positions near limited water sources, had fortified oases and wells. Americans needed to dislodge them to maintain access routes. But real challenge wasn't Chinese military. Was environment where water scarcity created tactical problems that firepower couldn't solve. U.S. Marines deployed 6,000 troops assuming water logistics could be managed through resupply. Chinese forces numbered 22,000 and controlled most natural water sources in operational area. Both sides understood that water would be critical. Neither understood how decisive it would become. Planning assumed 14 days maximum. Marines would seize water sources through aggressive operations, establish supply lines, force Chinese withdrawal through superior combat capability. Timeline was based on normal logistics calculations that didn't account for water consumption at 145 degrees, exceeding any historical precedent. Day 1. Marines entered desert. Temperature was 138 Fahrenheit in shade that didn't exist. Initial water consumption exceeded projections within hours. Each Marine required 2 to 3 gallons daily just to maintain function. 6,000 Marines meant 12,000 to 18,000 gallons daily minimum. Resupply couldn't keep pace with demand. Water shortage began immediately. Day 2. First dehydration casualties. 8 Marines evacuated with severe dehydration despite aggressive hydration protocols. Temperature reached 142 Fahrenheit. Exertion in extreme heat was consuming water faster than it could be supplied or consumed. Medical teams warned that sustained operations would create mass dehydration casualties within days. Day 3. Marines attempted to seize nearest water source, oasis controlled by Chinese forces. Assault required advancing across open desert in 145-degree heat. Marines became dehydrated during approach. Attack was disorganized. Chinese defense was minimal, but Marines were too heat-exhausted to exploit. Assault failed. Marines withdrew with 40 dehydration casualties and 12 combat casualties. Day 4. Water crisis developed. Marines had consumed 70% of available water. Resupply was delayed by sandstorm. Troops were rationed to survival minimum, barely enough to prevent death, insufficient to maintain combat effectiveness. This was operational crisis, where Marines couldn't fight because they were too dehydrated to function effectively. Day 5. Emergency water resupply arrived by helicopter, but consumption continued exceeding supply. Chinese forces controlled 3 major water sources in operational area. Marines controlled none. This was strategic disadvantage, where Chinese could hydrate normally, while Marines struggled with rationing that degraded capability. Day 7. 1 week in Gobi Desert. Marine casualties. 28 from dehydration causes, 20 combat deaths. 48 total casualties. Chinese casualties estimated at 60+, but Chinese maintained hydration and combat effectiveness, while Marines were degrading from water shortage. Marines realized they were in water war more than conventional combat. Chinese strategy was letting dehydration kill Marines while conserving Chinese strength. Every day, Marines remained in desert was day they weakened, while Chinese remained stable. This was a symmetric warfare where controlling water created insurmountable advantage. Day 10. Marines adapted tactics, stopped aggressive operations, focused on securing nearest water source, dug well at suspected water table location. After 24 hours, found water at 40 feet depth, created supply that reduced dependence on resupply helicopters. This was survival adaptation that changed operational dynamics. Chinese forces responded by attempting to destroy Marine well. Mortar attacks, raids, harassment, designed to prevent Marines from accessing their only local water source. This created situation where Marines had to defend water more than defend positions. Well became most strategic location in entire operational area. Day 14. 2 weeks at 145 degrees. Marine casualties. 68 from dehydration causes. 48 combat deaths. Total 116 casualties. 1.9% casualty rate. Chinese casualties estimated at 180+, but Chinese controlled water sources and maintained operational advantage, while Marines struggled with hydration. Marines held 1 well providing minimal water. Chinese controlled 3 major oases providing abundant water. Strategic imbalance remained despite Marine success in creating local water source. Chinese could sustain operations indefinitely. Marines were surviving, but not thriving. Day 80. This is where Marines discovered truth about Chinese desert operations that explained entire campaign strategy. Chinese forces weren't just controlling water, they were weaponizing thirst, had deliberately poisoned wells outside their controlled areas, had contaminated water sources that Marines might access, were using dehydration as primary weapon and conventional forces as supporting element. This was environmental warfare where Chinese had turned water scarcity into systematic weapon system. Marines discovered this when patrol found abandoned Chinese position with well that appeared intact. Marines drank before testing. 4 became violently ill. Water was contaminated with biological agent that caused severe illness, making soldiers unable to function. This was deliberate sabotage designed to deny water to Americans and create casualties through contamination when Marines became desperate enough to drink from uncontrolled sources. Discovery, reframed campaign. Chinese weren't fighting conventional war in desert. We're fighting water war where objective was making Marines too dehydrated to operate effectively. Every Chinese position was built around water control. Every tactical decision was based on hydration advantage. This was warfare where water was weapon and thirst was tactical tool. Stay with me. What happened on day 25 proved that continuing operation meant accepting casualties from dehydration that exceeded any combat losses and forced choice between withdrawing through waterless desert or continuing forward accepting environmental deaths. Day 20. Marines shifted strategy completely. Stopped trying to defeat Chinese militarily. Focused on water security. Dug additional wells. established filtration for contaminated sources, created hydration sustainability that allowed continued operations. This was admission that water logistics mattered more than tactical operations. Chinese adapted by intensifying attacks on marine water, destroyed filtration equipment, created tactical situation where Marines spent more effort defending water than conducting military operations. This was inversion where support infrastructure became primary objective and combat operations became secondary. Day 23. Marines suffered from cumulative dehydration effects. Soldiers who'd survived 3 weeks showed chronic effects: kidney stress, cognitive impairment, physical weakness. Even with improved water access, sustained dehydration at 145 degrees was degrading human capability beyond recovery through hydration alone. Casualties continued from dehydration-induced errors. Marines making mistakes from impaired judgment, walking into ambushes, misidentifying targets, losing tactical awareness. This was insidious effect, where dehydration created cascading failures in military operations that normally functioned through training and discipline that dehydration destroyed. Day 25. Critical decision point. Marine casualties: 120 from dehydration causes, 80 combat deaths. Total 200 casualties. 3.3% casualty rate. Chinese casualties estimated at 380 plus, but Chinese maintained operations and controlled strategic water sources while Marines held minimal hydration that kept them alive but not combat effective. Command faced reality. Operation was failing due to water logistics that couldn't sustain campaign. Marines could survive but couldn't advance. Chinese could sustain stalemate, where Chinese won by not losing because they controlled resource that Marines needed to fight. Withdrawal decision faced same problem. Retreating through waterless desert meant accepting dehydration casualties during movement. Marines were water-dependent on wells they'd created. Couldn't abandon without accepting deaths from dehydration during withdrawal. Were trapped by same resource they needed to survive. Day 30. Decision made to continue operations despite casualties. Political considerations prevented withdrawal. Strategic importance of terrain justified accepting environmental casualties. Marines would remain fighting war where water mattered more than weapons and dehydration killed more than combat. Day 32. Marines attempted major offensive. Coordinated assault on Chinese oases using all available forces. This was all-out effort to seize water source that would change operational balance. Success would provide hydration security. Failure would mean continued degradation. Chinese defense was effective. Had fortified oasis. Knowing it was strategic objective, Marines would attack eventually. Marines assaulted across open desert in 145-degree heat, becoming dehydrated during approach. Attack succeeded, but at cost of 60 casualties, mix of combat and dehydration from exertion, without adequate hydration during assault. Marines captured oasis, secured major water source, changed strategic balance. But price was severe, and force was degraded from sustained operations in extreme heat with chronic dehydration effects. Day 35. Marines controlled 2 water sources, providing adequate hydration. Chinese controlled 1 major oasis. Strategic balance shifted, but wasn't decisively in American favor. Both sides could sustain operations. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Day 40. 6 weeks approaching. Final decision made to conclude operations. Marines would hold captured water sources as success. Chinese would retain remaining strategic positions. Both sides would claim victory. Both would exit desert that had killed impartially through dehydration, that didn't discriminate between sides. Final casualties. Marines, 180 from dehydration causes, 120 combat deaths. Total, 300 casualties. 5% casualty rate. Chinese forces, Estimated 680 killed or wounded, including dehydration casualties. 3.1% casualty rate from larger force that controlled more water sources initially. Now here's complete truth that reframes entire 40-day dehydration battle. Campaign was ultimately about water control, not military dominance. Marines succeeded partially by capturing water sources, but paid 5% casualty rate, where 60% of deaths were from dehydration, not combat. Chinese strategy of weaponizing water created conditions where Americans died from thirst as much as bullets. Both sides learned that desert warfare at 145 degrees is primarily about hydration, and whoever controls water controls battlefield, regardless of military capabilities. 180 Marines died from dehydration, more than combat deaths. This proved desert warfare at extreme temperatures is about water logistics more than tactical operations. Technology and training don't overcome dehydration. Controlling water is strategic imperative that determines victory or defeat, regardless of combat outcomes. 40 days proved that some environments create resource dependencies that become primary factors, determining operational success. Chinese weaponization of water through contamination and control created asymmetric advantage that American military power couldn't overcome without securing water sources. This is environmental warfare, where resource control matters more than firepower. Remember, Day 18, discovery that Chinese poisoned wells? That revealed systematic strategy of weaponizing dehydration. Chinese weren't just controlling water, were denying it to Americans through contamination that created casualties when desperation drove Marines to drink from unsecured sources. This is warfare where environment becomes weapon through resource denial. Remember, Day 25, trapped by water dependency. That proved withdrawal through waterless desert was as deadly as continuing forward. Marines were locked into campaign by hydration requirements that made retreat fatal. This is tactical trap, where environment creates conditions that prevent disengagement regardless of military situation. Remember, 60% of Marine deaths were from dehydration, not combat. That proved water is deadlier than bullets in extreme desert. Chinese understood this and built strategy around letting dehydration kill Americans, while Chinese maintained hydration advantage. This is asymmetric environmental warfare, where resource control is primary weapon. Quick question. In 40-day campaign where Marines took 5% casualties, with 60% from dehydration, while capturing water sources, but Chinese retained strategic positions, taking 3.1% casualties, who won? A. Marines through water source capture. B. Chinese through resource control strategy. C. Desert through dehydration killing both sides. D. Nobody, because both sides learned water matters more than weapons. Real answer is D, with Chinese advantage. Campaign proved. Desert warfare is about water, and Chinese strategy of weaponizing dehydration created conditions where Marines died from thirst, proving resource control is ultimate military advantage in extreme environments. The Navy Chronicle decodes operations that prove water is most strategic, resource in desert warfare, and dehydration is weapon that determines outcomes when environment becomes primary challenge, transcending conventional military capabilities. The 40-day campaign ended. Marines captured water sources, claiming partial success. 180 Marines dead from dehydration, proving thirst kills more than combat in extreme desert. 120 combat deaths were minority compared to environmental casualties. Chinese retained strategic positions, having proven water control is supreme military advantage in desert where dehydration is deadlier than bullets, and hydration determines operational success, regardless of tactical capabilities. And somewhere military planners study operation. Write doctrine for desert water operations. Calculate hydration requirements for extreme heat. But real lesson can't be taught in classroom. Can only be learned by Marines who fought 40 days at 145 degrees and discovered that water is ultimate weapon in desert, an enemy that controls hydration controls battlefield, regardless of firepower or technology. Lesson is that environmental resource dependencies determine outcomes in extreme conditions, and military forces that can't secure water lose battles before engaging enemy effectively. Welcome to Dehydration Battle, where 145 degrees proved water is life and death. Where 40 days cost 5% marine casualties and 60% died from dehydration, not combat. Where Chinese weaponized water, creating strategic advantage through resource control. Where Marines learned that desert warfare is ultimately about hydration, and whoever controls water sources controls battlefield, regardless of conventional military superiority, when environment becomes supreme factor determining survival and operational capability. The Navy Chronicle, where 40-day Gobi Desert campaign proved water is deadliest weapon and dehydration kills more effectively than bullets when temperature reaches 145 degrees and resource control determines victory in warfare, where environment matters more than firepower.